Hello and bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for joining the Deloitte AI Institute Canada webcast on generative AI. My name is Audrey Anderson, and I have the pleasure of leading our AI Institute in Canada. Before we begin, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We do acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today. Deloitte Canada has offices with representation across most of the country. We acknowledge that our offices reside on traditional, treaty, and unceded territories as part of Turtle Island, and is still home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Lastly, please note that this webcast will be recorded and made available on our Deloitte AI Institute webpage. You will also be able to view this video in the language of your preference. Now let's come back to our topic of today, generative AI. Recently, generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI, has been overwhelming our global media and news outlet. In fact, it would have been almost impossible to have missed any discussions around this transformative technology. Generative AI is a subset of artificial intelligence focused on the ability of machines to create new content in the form of text, code, voice, images, video, processes, and even the 3D structures of proteins. This new poster child of AI has, again, stimulated the imagination of many on how we can use it to the benefit of society, while also it has pushed, again, a discussion around the fear of losing jobs, legal questions, and questions around IP, or intellectual property ownership. In our webcast today, we aim to demystify what generative AI is. We want to do three things: focus on what generative AI is and how it works. And then we want to talk about the so what. What are the applications, the enterprise, the business applications of generative AI? But also, what are some of the legal, ethical considerations for using it in a trustworthy fashion? And last but not least, we want to make sure that you have some guidelines and ideas for how to get started with generative AI. To help us with this webcast, we have two great panelists today that I am going to introduce to you in a second. Our first panelist is Ivan Jan. Ivan is the co-founder of Cohere, a provider of cutting-edge natural language processing models, or NLP models, that is solving all kinds of language problems, including text summarization, composition, classification, and more. After starting as a foundational software engineer, Ivan rose to lead Cohere's product organization, focusing on product management and the developer experience. Ivan actually moved to Canada from China when he was 8, settling in with his family in the Scarborough section of Toronto. He turned to entrepreneurship at a very young age, selling his mother's baked good and working as a part-time photographer. Ivan later discovered his passion for coding in his teens, and a friend recommended that he try out a computer science class. After taking a few courses at the University of Toronto, Ivan crossed paths with his future co-founder, Aidan Gomez. The two collaborated on a summer research project, publishing a paper entitled Unsupervised Cipher, Cracking Using Discrete GANs, or Generative Adversarial Networks. And he co-founded 4.ai, an independent research group where the team published a number of conference papers on text-based GANs and serving efficiency. In the broader realm of NLP, or natural language processing, Ivan is passionate about developing a product that is as effective as it is ethical. And he remains committed to applying that mindset to Cohere's research and development efforts. Ivan is based out of Toronto and is extremely proud of its rising status as a major international tech hub and recent business momentum. Ivan, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, I'm so excited to be here.
Fantastic. Our second panelist will be Jaz Jaj. Jaz is our managing partner for AI data and analytics called Omnia AI. With more than 20 years of experience in tech, data, and AI, Jaz is passionate about fueling the Canadian economy by leveraging the power of AI. His work seeks to infuse AI and a data-informed approach into all key market offerings to bring differentiated value to our client transformation journey. He is a change agent and an active advisor to multiple boards and the AI startup ecosystem, including being a member of the Canada Space Agency Advisory Council on Deep Space Healthcare, where he is helping shape Canada's role in deep space missions to the moon and Mars. Wow, Jas, thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks for that awesome intro, Audrey, and excited to be here.
Fantastic. So I mentioned this briefly, but just to make sure that you all know what we're going to be discussing today, I wanted to share with you the questions that I have for both Jas and Ivan as part of today's webcast. And the reason we're sharing those up front is to make sure that you have time to formulate your own questions. We'll go through these, and at the end of the webcast, we'll make sure to ask Ivan and Jas your respective questions. So first part will be about what Gen AI is, why now, why it's different, how it works. The second part will be about applications, concrete enterprise applications on the one hand, as well as risk limitations, considerations on the other. And we'll close with how to get started. But before I start grilling or asking questions to our esteemed panelists, let me ask you, our audience, a question. We would love to understand from you how confident you are in explaining what generative AI. I'm sure that you've heard many news reports, have read articles, seen many TV shows, but really wondering what your take is around your confidence explaining what it is, and how it's relevant to your organization. We will repoll you right after this session, but for now, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to give us your answer. Fantastic. Thank you for that. So first question I would love to turn it over to Jas. Oh, thank you. We're seeing the results right now. Sorry about that. Thank you. Oh, wow. Okay. So this is a very interesting split. Definitely when we look at 8 and above, it doesn't seem like we have super champions as part of the audience yet. So you're quite cognizant of what you know, but also what you don't know. So some of you obviously have heard many things, but wouldn't consider yourselves experts. Jas, Ivan, any reactions from your part on the poll results?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess it's what I expected. It's a relatively new field that's changing day by day even. So, don't beat yourselves up.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
It's just that I think, the fact that this space is evolving so fast, Audrey, I feel like over the next couple of years, our familiarity with this space is going to be significantly more. And the fact that we're seeing such a even spread, in some cases, people, feel like they have a fairly decent understanding, while in some cases not that familiar. I think this will be dynamic in that as new things come up, it might also make us question as to whether do we really understand this space as well as we think we do, as new information is unfolded in terms of how, let's say, some of these models work. So it'll be very interesting to see how the space evolves over the next little while.
Absolutely. You're right, Jas. I think AI fluency and AI literacy is constantly evolving and changing. And thank you to our audience for sharing their thoughts with us. Let's get started with some definitions. And Jas, you've been working in this space for some time now. So I'm wondering if you could share with our audience how you've been defining generative AI and also what excites you about this landscape.
Indeed. So I think in terms of the definition, you summarized it well at the onset of your introduction. So it is a subset of AI that involves training algorithms to generate content that is, I would say, reassembled or derived from the corpus of information that these models are trained on, what we refer to as large language models. Now, what I find the most interesting part of this is that the fact that we are operating in a space where there are different modalities involved when it comes to the inputs, and then also different modalities that are involved in terms of the outputs of what the models generate. And with every emerging technology, there is always this inflection point that there's a lot of research goes in, there's a lot of investment that goes in, there's a lot of cost that goes in to be able to move the dial to a point where the accuracy of the results and the outputs of what the area is supposed to be creating shifts to a point where it's ready for, let's say, mass adoption, because the value is there. And what we observed in, I would say, the last probably 4 or 5 months, I'll go back to November when OpenAI released their version of ChatGPT. It was a big realization for a lot of us that, even though these models may not be fully accurate, they might be, let's say, 80% or so accurate, but there was enough value for us to be able to jump on board and actually start to be curious about what else we can use this for. And from my view, I definitely think we're still far away from approaching the area of these algorithms mimicking human intelligence. But let's just say it was a big step forward in that now, when you look at the broader spectrum of generative AI, this notion of multimodal learning is fascinating, whereby using techniques like fusion, you can actually bring and combine different modalities of information into a single feature representation, as an example. You can use co-training to be able to train multiple models on different modalities simultaneously. And then you can use transfer learning to be able to transfer the knowledge learned in one modality to the other. So all of this comes underneath the broader umbrella of generative AI in this multimodal learning paradigm, which I think is going to be the big breakthrough, which is why we feel this is the next platform shift that we are encountering, and the use cases are going to be tremendous.
Super. Thanks, Jas, for laying those strong foundations from a terminology perspective. With you, Ivan, I'm wondering if we can both go back in time and travel in time, because when we're listening to reports about Gen AI, it feels like it was just born in November when ChatGPT was released, but that's not a fact. And so I'm hoping you can paint a broader picture for us.
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, I've been through, I guess, 2 versions of generative AI in my career now, and I imagine those of you who've been in the ML field even longer have gone through many more versions of this. I think the big difference this time around, and thanks, Jas, for the overview, is that now these models are sort of they're pre-trained on this diverse and rich data set of the web and many more language sources. But the wonderful thing about language is it's like a very efficient way of compressing our understanding of the world. And so training a model to understand language is giving it that world context and world knowledge to the best of our capabilities of describing the world within language. And so I'd say the big difference this time around is that these models used in this version of generative AI has this world context, world knowledge from being trained on just tons and tons of data from the internet, from various books and sources, et cetera, et cetera. And I would, basically it's like, you for your enterprise adopting this tech, using it from one of the providers like Cohere or OpenAI. It's sort of like bringing someone who's went through JK to 12, right? For us and our kids going to school, they're getting this general understanding of the world, learning a diverse set of skills. But you do want them to sort of specialize within one domain for your company, in some sort of university that you care about. So I'd say, yeah, the big difference is this pre-training thing for this version.
Sounds good. Thanks for that. And to again, in the spirit of sharing knowledge with our audience, wondering if you can talk to us about how generative AI works. What are the inputs to generative AI? How to think about those inputs? What's the process magic, maybe, or the work that you do? So in layman terms, talk to us about how it works at a high level.
Yes, so I would think about generative AI as a really great learner of sequence problems. So if you have a large data set of sequences where you have discrete elements, so words, proteins, codons, generative transformers, which is the architecture that backs this version of generative AI, are really, really great at capturing sort of like the statistical likelihood of every token at every position for your problem. So I would say it's like a really great model for sequence problems. So if you have sequence problems, you can leverage sort of the latest state-of-the-art technology today.
Sounds good. And maybe, Jazz, I could ask you to augment and complement Ivan's response by sharing with our audience your considerations on inputs, right? But also helping our business audience think about what might a sequence problem look like.
Right. So first, Audrey, what I'll say is Ivan was being a little humble when he was talking about the waves and the role that him and the organization that he's a part of, Cohere, played in this. So back when, like, I would say the moment that this space really took a big shift is when this notion of the transformer architecture was introduced in this paper back in 2017 called "Attention is All You Need." And Ivan and his buddy that he was referring to earlier, Aidan Gomez, was one of the co-authors of this paper. And to me, the profound moment during that time was the elegance and the simplicity of this architecture and how it brought efficiency compared to, let's say, previous architectures and techniques to be able to build models at scale, and how to efficiently use the underlying infrastructure, that is the GPU layer, in an effective manner. So the fact that that evolution happened in the architecture space has allowed us to be able to use generative AI applications with the accuracy and the scale that you're seeing right now. Now, to the question in terms of how it works, from the conversations I've had in the AI community, even at that time, it wasn't clear in terms of all the different ways in which this transformer architecture can be used. Initially, it was designed purely based for translation use cases, right? Translating from one language to the other. But later on, it was realized that the same principles can actually be used for different modalities like images and video and audio. And that is where the big aha moments kicked in. And when it comes to the leverage that enterprises can get as a result of now there being these pre-trained large language models available from organizations like OpenAI, like Cohere, like Google, as an example, and even certain open source models available at Hugging Face, is that by augmenting these models with a certain amount of sample data, which would be the additional input that can come from enterprise information that is available, there is this ability to fine-tune these models to be able to cater their outputs for use cases that are relevant for the particular enterprise. Mm-hmm. And that is game-changing, where now you're using the power of these large language models where a ton of investment has gone in, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars of investment has gone in, which no single organization can, let's say, do themselves for the most part. And now that this base version is available and you can be efficient in terms of the samples you add on it to be able to make it more tailored towards your use cases and your insights that you're looking for, to me is like game-changing. So I'll just pause there in terms of just to add to the really good explanation that Ivan gave in terms of what is the essence of how these models work.
Yeah, that's exactly right. even though the big sort of boon in this this phase of generative AI is the pre-training step, it is very expensive to collect and train from scratch one of these large language models, just like raising a kid JK to 12. So that's why we've built Cohere to sort of front that cost so that your organization could benefit from this technology.
So we've defined generative AI. We've at a high level described how it works. I would love if we could address the first question we actually got from one of the audience member around like the applications, how to apply generative AI. Where is it best applied? Can I ask you, Jazz, and you, Ivan, to share with us a few use cases?
Yeah, I can start. So I imagine, a lot of the language in the current climate change sector probably lives within, policies and legal documents about, what the policies are in every geography. One of the ways we've seen customers have a ton of success, even just in the, general legal domain, is just a way better search over these documents. So, currently the state of the art is like, Elasticsearch or something like that, where you can really efficiently find documents that have the same keyword as your query. But obviously, you don't exactly know what words are in your document that you're looking for all the time. The great thing about models that can understand language is that you can actually search for documents based on the meaning. Using the actual language model's understanding of your query, it knows that, oh, like this is, really similar to these documents. So even in the climate change sector, you could build like a way better legal search over policies that might be relevant for, whatever effort you're working on.
Love it. Search on steroids, or a new kind of search. Jazz, how about your take on some of the key use cases that you predict will get a lot of traction in the coming months, years?
Certainly. So maybe I'll share a very interesting data point that I came across, which is an indicator in terms of the number of applications and use cases that are coming up. Over the last 6 months or so, there have been over 500 startups that have come to bear to be able, that are using generative AI to be able to apply it in different domains and industries. 500 plus startups in this short time frame, which is mind blowing. And when you look at the amount of VC capital that's going into this space, it's close to 20 billion in the last 6 months. Obviously, a big chunk of that 10 billion comes from those of you who have been reading the Microsoft investment in OpenAI. 10 billion is there, but still, when you look at the balance, it's significant in the short time frame that's gone into this particular space. And that's primarily because of the application areas that are coming up left, right, and center. Maybe to simplify this, we should take a step back, and I'll give you a perspective in terms of 3 big buckets that we see the use cases stem from. The first one, as Ivan was describing, is when you're looking at this, when there's huge corpuses of information available. And as we know, like in this age, the amount of digital information has like exploded in different modalities, right? Images, videos, text, and whatnot. The first category of use cases where generative AI can play a big role is being able to synthesize and summarize vast amounts of information into something which is consumable and actionable, right? Now, this applies across many, many different industries. When you look at, certain research, that's done for certain areas, be it in life sciences and healthcare, if you're doing analysis for where your loyalty programs need to be focused on from the consumer segment, there's a huge amount of information that you typically are absorbing to be able to make your targeted marketing campaigns. So that's like one broad bucket, right? The second one, which is really going to be game changing, is when it comes to applications, enterprise applications. We are entering a world where every application will have this element of generative AI embedded inside it, where generative AI is going to play the role of an assistant. Now, this assistant you can either ask it, how do I use a particular application? Or you can ask it to do the task for you, right? So now think about the number of the efficiency, the productivity, and the way in which this can change the game when it comes to this whole new class of software that's going to be created. And existing software, large ERPs, CRM applications, everyone will start to embed this technology within their systems to be able to give the user that productivity that everyone is looking for. And then the third category is autocomplete for everything. And what I mean by that is when it comes to report generation, when it comes to if there's any piece of, let's say, artifact you need to create for a campaign, as an example, if there's a deck that you need to create for a big presentation that's coming up, anywhere where information has to be created, generative AI will help us do that faster. And in some cases, it can do the entire thing for us. This also, by the way, applies to code generation, where applications will be built by generative AI technologies, with us primarily giving as input our intent in prompts by saying, I want an application created that has these features and so elements of design with this output. Boom, an application gets created for you, right? So think about the power of this, where we've always wanted to personalize the user experience. We've always wanted to go after that segment of one that we talk about. This technology is going to help us move and accelerate our path there. So I would say the big use cases, Audrey, are going to fall in these three buckets, and they will apply across all industries.
Yeah, and
Thanks.
I'll just add on. I mean, yeah, a great point about action. I think that's something, you know, we're really excited about at Cohere, you know, having these language models being able to act on behalf of the user. I just want to add that, like, to actually customize these models and train these models for your organization, it ends up being super easy. Like, these models, after they've been pre-trained on petabytes of data to understand language, you are able to teach them with not that much more data on tasks very specific to your organization. So we've seen a ton of success of just, you know, organizations taking our models, training it just a tiny bit more to do the precise use case that they need to solve for their language problem.
Thanks for that, Ivan. Jazz, you mentioned an expected productivity gain. Ivan, you talk about the role of people in training the models and going an extra mile. I was hoping we could start a conversation on the impact of this new technology on people. Whenever there's a big step change in technology, people, you know, both get excited but also fear about the role of humans in the workplace. You know, we saw some substitution, right, of humans for machines, for example, in car manufacturing in the 60s and 70s. Over time, we've seen augmentation of humans through machine learning models. Let's say I adjudicate loans or cases, right? I'm being augmented. But I wanted to understand what you foresee the role of generative AI have in terms of employees and team members. What kind of skills do you believe we humans should be honing in, should be developing? What will be expected of us that hasn't been up to this point?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective,
go ahead.
I truly believe that everyone needs to get really good at teaching. I think in the future, you know, with these models being able to understand language, that's essentially allowing anyone who can give instructions in language to program the computer to do anything they want, right? Right now, it's sort of bottlenecked by, you know, how fast you're able to learn how to code. You have to learn how to code to actually give the computer instructions to do a thing. But with, you know, generative AI or large language models, you could simply describe the task you want to do, and you could, you know, make a program to do it. So being able to give great instructions, I would say is a hugely valuable skill.
Well said, Ivan. Jazz, your take on skills we will need, our workforce will need to work with AI in a productive and trustworthy fashion?
Yeah. So from my view, like what I encourage everyone, the most important skill is this element of curiosity that all of us should really hone in on. Because now what this particular space has done is it is played a big part in leveling the playing field when it comes to the number of individuals can harness the power of AI to be able to create things. Before, it was, let's say, a relatively smaller group of data scientists, machine learning engineers, and whatnot that actually had the ability to be able to use a really like a powerful technology like this to be able to create things. And now, in the AI community, we joke at times where we say that, English is going to become one of the hottest programming languages, right? And this is coming from this notion of the fact that these prompts that we provide these large language models is basically they're English prompts that can be used to generate significant output, be it, let's say, a report, be it an application, be it a video, be it like having an application execute tasks for you, right? So there's a whole explosion of new workers that will be entering into this category to be able to collectively lift the productivity of organizations across the board, is my view. Individual workers who were, let's say, involved in this space or had familiarity with this space, I think will get a 10x lift by having some of the mundane tasks, some of the things that they've been doing automated or generated by this particular class of technologies. And then there'll be new job functions. There'll be new categories of jobs that'll be created to be able to continue to build on the momentum that this area will generate. That's my view in general.
Thanks, Jas. Thanks, Ivan, for your perspectives. I'm summarizing that we need to be better teachers. We need to learn how to teach, but we also need to be students, be curious, just like Jas mentioned. We need to harness that student in us as well. So, but we need to be both teachers and students in parallel. Now, we've received a few questions on the risks, the ethical, the legal considerations of generative AI. I was hoping that we could go there next. When you think about 100 years ago, right, when all the 4Ts were released onto the market, we didn't necessarily have, the, seat belts and road signs everywhere. There were some legal considerations missing at the time. And so now we have, again, a new change, a new technology. Not everything has been put in place. And I'm wondering if you can share with our audience some of the things that we should be proactively thinking about to make sure that we use generative AI, again, in a trusted fashion. Ivan, can I start with you first?
Yeah, definitely. So I think my goal today is to have you leave with the understanding that generative AI is not an arbiter of truth, right? Even though sometimes might accidentally say something that is true, that it's just, recalling what it's seen from memory. Right now, at least, when we train these models, they're sort of frozen in their knowledge of what's happened, right? If you train a model a month ago, it's only known stuff on the internet up to that month ago. So they tend to get out of date, and so they should not be relied on for truth, because we already have tools to solve truth, right? We have databases, we have file systems to sort of say like, okay, like this thing is a piece of data, is a piece of knowledge. We should not rely on language models for data or knowledge retention. There are, organizations like Cohere, OpenAI, we're all working on grounding these models based on facts and some database. So these models should be looking up against some data set that is kept up to date. Maybe that's a Google search, maybe that's your organization's internal knowledge base, and then having whatever's retrieved inform what it responds back to the user. So I would say currently don't treat these models as arbiters of truth. Also, because these models relies so heavily on human teaching, whatever biases the humans have will be encapsulated within these models. That there's really no silver bullet to avoid this, right? Like if you have to train like a junior analyst, that analyst is going to capture whatever biases their manager will have as well. And once you actually start deploying these models to production and you're sort of fine tuning these models to your specific use case, the trap that we've seen a lot of users run into is actually data quality. So the quality of the data that goes into these models, how good your instructions to outputs are, really matter. Even one wrong instruction will confuse the model, and you'll have a bad time in production. So data quality really matters. You need to have humans in the loop, sort of annotating the data that goes into your models. And yeah, I mean, do not treat these things as facts or knowledge, not knowledge bases. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I've been very clear. Not arbiters of the truth. Jazz, how about your take on key considerations?
Yeah, I'll pick on a couple of others. So, I will say that the passion with which how bullish I am in terms of the fact that this is the next platform shift, I'm equally sensitive to making sure we do this right, with all the right guardrails, with all the right guidance when it comes to the legal structure with which different jurisdictions operate and the regulatory frameworks that these jurisdictions have to work within. So it's imperative that we spend an equal amount of time understanding that so that we start off on the right foot. And there's a whole body of work that's happening in terms of making inroads in this space. So for example, when it comes to areas like ownership and IP, I think this is a rather controversial topic, and many of you must have seen, lawsuits starting to spring up, where I think the question to ask is, when it comes to the outputs of these models, who owns them? And typically, when you look at copyright laws, there has been a tight binding in terms of the work product with the author, right? And that is how the legal system has viewed when it comes to infringement or any other type of misuse. The first question to ask is like, who is the true author? And when it comes to the outputs that are coming out of the large language models, it's not clear, right? Like when you look at the different parts, as we spoke about earlier, in terms of the pieces that go into creating this, you have the user at one end where they are prompting the model to create stuff. So a question can be, is that the author? The second stakeholder here is the actual model, the developers that created the model that are producing the output for the user. Is that the author? And the third stakeholder, which is where all the information came from, which actually is what the models are using to be able to create the derived or the outputs that it is creating. Are they the author who should be worried about copyright infringement, if you will, right? And there are, based on the jurisdiction, based on the way in which the models are being used, the answers are different and nuanced, right? And there's a whole, in fact, webinar we can do just on this topic, Audrey, but I will just kind of put this provocation out there that people should not simply think that, oh, because I have created this output from one of the large language models, be it an image or a video or a piece of text, that I am the true owner. Even though, let's say, certain organizations like OpenAI with ChatGPT, in their terms, they have said that the user, the number one scenario that I described, they are the author of what has been created and the ownership is transferred over to them. But different large language models will deal it differently. Now, if you're paying for a large language model, the answer can be different versus when it's free, right? So there are all these other implications that come in that have to be factored in when you're thinking about things like IP protection and ownership. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Jazz. We actually got a question from Craig on the legislation piece. He's asking, do you feel that legislation will be largely reactionary, i.e. something bad happens, a downfall is identified late in the game, and then a law is created in response to that? Or do you think the lawmakers are getting equipped to proactively identify where legislation is required? Ivan, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, ideally it's proactive, very ideally, but I think because the space is moving so quickly and just the technology is moving so fast, it's hard to, be a policymaker while also, being an expert in the space and understanding the implications. If I had to bet, unfortunately, I think it will be reactionary. But ideally it's not. Ideally, it's a very proactive and reasonable set of policies.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. Jazz, I know that also when we think about generative AI or AI more generally, we think about use case by use case, right? There are the risks usually present per use case may be different, whether you're talking about a chatbot or search engine or an augmented decision tool. So what's your take on the legislation and how far it will go?
Yeah, like I do feel, Audrey, we're approaching a time where the policymakers, if you will, in the various jurisdictions have a huge responsibility. Because if we don't move fast enough to be able to institute policies and laws which strike the right balance to fuel innovation so that all the positive things that we've spoken about can be realized, while also having the right controls in place to make sure that the negative consequences that we've spoken about are not activated to actually make it harmful for society. I think there's a ton of responsibility and it's not easy, but we have to move fast to be able to put something in place to eliminate this element of uncertainty that exists right now for enterprises to really jump on board. Right now, when you look at Canada, since we are doing this in Canada, I'll kind of highlight a couple of things that we are looking at in Canada. One is Bill C-27, which is now in its second reading in the House of Commons. That is a three-part bill, and the third part focuses on AI, right? AI and data. Now, it's promising to see that we are proactively doing something about it, assuming that we can move fast enough. Now, in that part of the bill, we refer to high impact systems, which will have a certain amount of controls applied versus medium and low. And I personally feel like that's a fairly reasonable way of looking at things, where when the stakes are high, when the risk is high, you take an approach of having a certain level of control applied, while when the stakes are low, you can take a different approach. But what's important is to actually properly define what is high impact, what is medium and low impact in that scenario. And that's where we don't have clarity right now, right? So these are the types of things where, policymakers have to move, I'll say, fast, be precise, not leave it so open-ended that out of hesitancy, because the fines are big. There's up to $25 million worth of fines that our regulation has put in place to be able to, or, it's 25 million in Quebec, but for the federal one, it's 5% of total income, total revenue, right? So that those fines can be huge and stifle innovation if the right level of precision is not there in terms of what can be done versus cannot be done. So
makes sense. Thanks for your perspective on that question. A few other questions were on privacy and security risks. Aisha, I'm wondering if we can go to our next slide, and if I can get your take on how to mitigate those risks. So on this slide, we can see that, keeping the data and the information private, safe and secure, making sure that our models are fair and impartial, making sure that we're doing this in a responsible way, that we're not amplifying fake news, fake information, and that we are transparent, sharing our sources. How would you say, Ivan, Cohere is working to make sure to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, so we do a ton of things in this area. So one of the first things is actually just publishing best practices for, having human in the loop to sort of verify, and then, depending on the use case and the risk tolerance, there's a trade-off of, having humans actually review the stuff before actually shipping it to another human being. We also actually provide means to access our models without us receiving the data ever. So, we just launched on SageMaker, where you can actually run our models on your cloud privately so that we don't ever get any of your user data whatsoever. And we're working on-prem and also, the same offerings on GCP and Azure. So you don't necessarily have to ship us your data to actually make use of this technology. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks for that. Jazz, your take on a few of these risks and or how to mitigate them.
Yeah. So I think the one around personal information and privacy is a big one. And we have some across the various jurisdictions, like we have some frameworks in place which come from the data protection regulation that exists. In Europe, you have GDPR. Canada, as I was mentioning earlier, we are, approaching to getting ours, updated. The US has its own, in California, as an example, with their data protection regulation. What's going to be critical is, so first of all, we have to make sure that the enterprise policies are refreshed and current to factor in what is really happening in this landscape now. So making sure that you are educating, building awareness in terms of what the refreshed policies are around data use is critical. That way you can mitigate it and then be proactive in terms of, as all, or I would say many large enterprises start to think about how do they expand their AI architecture to now include large language models into them. What are the right guardrails that need to be put in place to be able to actually activate this component in the overall AI architecture? Because every large organization and even medium-sized organization will have this as a component of their overall architecture as we move forward because of the value that we spoke about. And in fact, if you're not, you will risk disruption, you will risk being irrelevant as your competitors encroach in your particular space. So making sure that you are being mindful about it and educating, building awareness across the enterprise, what are the right ways to do it versus not. Whenever there's personal information involved, there should be a whole different workflow that gets activated in terms of how you actually use your data governance frameworks in organizations to be able to track where the information is coming from so that there's transparency and lineage in terms of what is actually feeding these models. And then when questions are asked, you need to be able to explain. Right? This whole area of explainable AI is really growing at an accelerated pace because of this. Every organization will need to have that level of transparency to explain the best they can, because a lot of these models at the end of the day, the biggest research scientists are not able to fully explain at the right level of detail in terms of how the model is really producing this output. So we will have to bring a lens of reasonability in terms of what is explainable versus not. But more importantly, we'll have to be transparent in terms of what are the inputs that have gone in, where did they come from, how trusted that was, because that is going to play a key role in terms of generating the output of what the final insights and actions the models will execute on.
Thanks for that comprehensive answer, Jazz. We've defined generative AI. We've talked about some of the key considerations: risk, legal, ethical, technical. How do we get started? I would love to get your thoughts and guidance, Ivan and Jazz, on for our audience, for our listeners, what would be the first few steps that they should be taking, and where does Gen AI work best? How to prioritize our use cases so that we get started with the right first few use cases. Ivan?
I would say this is probably the easiest new technology ever to get started with, because it takes language. You just describe what you want it to do and it'll do it. And there's many sort of, graphical interfaces to play with this stuff. I mean, there's, the Cohere playground, ChatGPT, obviously, just to get a sense of how these models work. And as for what is the right class of problems to point these models at, I mean, any language transformation that you need to do, right? Anything where you're sort of giving an input and you're expecting some sort of output, that's sort of what it's good at, which is, I know it sounds like a lot of things, but I mean, literally, it is just that good at a lot of things.
You're right in the sense that the experience, the UX is making it quite easy for a lot of us, even without technical training, to take apart. And I love your constant metaphors and links to education and learning and teaching. Really love that. Jazz, what about your take on how to get started? What our audience should think about in the next few weeks?
So, from my view, with all the signals that we have seen in that this is the next platform shift that is happening, it behooves every organization to have a strategy in place, do your strategy refresh when it comes to AI, analytics, data, automation, that whole bucket that is critical for organizations. So do a strategy refresh. And as a part of that, it's important to, as you make goals, sometimes it's easier to make anti-goals, and then that kind of becomes a way to focus on your goals. So in this case, an anti-goal would be, if you don't do anything, that's going to be a big problem, because you will be left behind in terms of being able to stay relevant, be very targeted towards your customers, employees, and suppliers with the level of personalization they will expect, because others will do it. And if you're not doing it, you will not look good, right? So first of all, have that conviction that we want to act, right? And the way you act in a systematic and logical way is by doing your strategy refresh. As part of that, as many of you folks would know, is you have to start to, in a disciplined way, start to identify use cases and categorize them across the different domains of your organization. There'll be some use cases that'll be highly desirable. There'll be some use cases that'll be feasible. There'll be some use cases that'll be viable or not viable, and going through some type of a structured process to come up with, what are the ones that we can focus on now in light of some of the uncertainty that exists, in light of the value that's going to be created by them, and then prioritize them. Make sure you are focused on acting and investing so that you can get the low-hanging fruit done as you're learning and growing. Be very particular about what capability you want to build in-house, what capability you want to be able to insource versus what capability you want to be able to outsource, right? In today's world, everyone doesn't have to build everything for everyone. So as a part of your strategy, being very deliberate about that would be also the recommendation that I would have as organizations think about what to do in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I double click that. I mean, you don't want to be in a position where your competitor already has generative AI features in production and you haven't started road mapping it, right?
Makes sense. And to help our audience with the education that both of you recommended to continuing to increase their fluency and literacy, I wanted to make sure to share on our next slide the future webcast that we will host. This is not the first and last webcast we do on generative AI. It's actually the first of a series of webcasts on this topic. And you can see in green in the middle of this slide, we will be hosting industry-specific sessions. So for example, on March 21st, for financial services industries companies, we will do a dedicated session. In April, on April 4th, we will focus on public sector and healthcare companies. Our fourth session will be dedicated to consumer, but also technology and media companies. And last but not least, our session on April 25th will focus on energy resources and industrials. So make sure to grab a picture of our QR code and register for those dedicated sessions. Fantastic. Just wanted to, if there are any more questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Now, I wanted to make sure that we repoll you, get a sense for how you now feel about generative AI. How do you feel about your level of confidence? I would love it, Aisha, if you could take us to our poll. Our second poll will give you 30 seconds, and then we'll talk to you about next steps very shortly. All right, let's see the results. Let's see if they're as spread out as at the onset of the call.
We're just giving people a few more minutes to respond. Our response rate is just a little bit lower, but just giving people a few more minutes. But the results are looking good.
While we do that, Aisha, maybe we can turn to our contacts page. So there's Ivan that you met today from Cohere. You can also reach out to Elizabeth Gao from Cohere. We wanted to make sure that you had access to their contact details, which are on this page. We've also been talking about both the benefits and the use cases. And so our colleagues Anna Nimkar and Gideon Chung are two team members that you can reach out to for more information, ideas on actual use cases with generative AI. And then we've talked about risks, but we could do a full day lab or webcast with both Priti and Chetan covering the legal dimensions and Priti our trustworthy AI framework. So wanted to make sure that you have those names at your disposal so you can reach out to them on LinkedIn and start a conversations on either of those topics. Super, thanks for that. And thanks for sharing the poll results. I can see there's a shift. Go ahead, Ivan. Any observations?
Yeah, a lot more tens. That's what I like to see.
That's perfect. So in closing, Jazz, Ivan, any final words of wisdom or any call to action for the folks on the call? This is obviously a major step change in the technology. What would be one call to action you would have for folks on the call?
I mean, definitely send me an email, but I did want to say a few words about Deloitte. Actually, it's I got a lot of love for Deloitte. Actually, when I was in undergrad, you guys would be at all the hackathons and stuff. Out there supporting with a big presence, and I still have a lot of friends who work here. Brenda, shout out to Brenda. But yeah, I love what Deloitte has done for the Canadian tech scene.
Thanks for that, Ivan. Jazz, any words of wisdom or call to action for our audience today?
I'll start by thanking yourself, Audrey, and the AI Institute team for being so focused in terms of having these sessions and building awareness, increasing the fluency, and educating our community when it comes to AI. So, thank you. And also thank you for the opportunity to be here today to share my perspectives. Ivan, I want to thank you as well. Like, it's been tremendous getting your insights, as someone who was in the front line of this big, revolution that we are seeing when it comes to how transformers are changing the game. So really appreciate, having this opportunity to chat with you and share some thoughts. In terms of call to action, what I would say is, the most important thing is to not be stagnant. And the fact that, as I was mentioning earlier, the playing field has been leveled, where now so many more individuals are empowered, and we're at a moment where AI is, we're really seeing how AI is getting democratized, where it's not going to be isolated to the really well-capitalized organizations. The power to be able to be curious and do things is coming into the hands of all of us. So the most important thing is to ignite that curiosity, think about the different ways in which this can help you, think about ways in which it can harm you and others as well, and be responsible around how we use it for the good of society, because if we use it the right way, there will be a ton of good.
Couldn't beat those closing words, Jazz, so we'll leave it at that. Thanks again to you and Ivan for joining us today. Merci à tous. Thank you for your questions. Bonne journée tout le monde. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.